Brilliant. Okay, so this is a continuation really from what John was talking about last time. And in particular, I want to look at how the oil crisis fits in with the overall crisis. So these are the topics I'm going to cover. You can see them there. And the big question is the way capital deals with this and the way we should deal with it are two different things. So the way capital deals with its crisis is it treats stranded assets as something that basically oil producing capital, which is no longer so productive. It just treats as a stranded asset. But basically the problem goes a bit deeper than that, as we will find out. It's more an issue of a stranded system. Next. Thank you. So these three pictures, the one on the top left, it's very small, but the dark blue are the OPEC countries and the lighter blue are what's known as OPEC plus. It's a grouping that's become quite important in the last 3 or 4 years in terms of oil production. The second graphic you will see is the price of what's known as West Texas Intermediate crude, which went negative, minus $37 a barrel on the 20th of April this year, just a few weeks ago. And the top right is a picture from The Economist, whose standpoint I don't share, but I thought it was worth seeing the picture, which puts Donald Trump in the driving seat, but facing a great dilemma. Does he move forward or does he move backwards? Because either way is collapse. So you do get a sense at least of existential crisis, even for Donald Trump. We'll see. Now, when it was known that the lockdown was coming, there was a very peculiar effect in the major capital markets in the United States, okay, which is what John was talking about last time. But there was also another thing happening in the background, and it may have a causal connection, which is just a couple of days before, the Saudi Arabian leadership and Russia fell out. They had been hoping to come to an agreement to restrict the production of oil, which would keep the price of oil up, but Russia refused to do it. And Saudi Arabia then said, okay, well, if you refuse to restrict your production, we will refuse to restrict ours. And not only that, we will increase our production in order to defend our share of the international oil market. And with the very predictable result that prices precipitately fell. Now, there's a huge commentariat on these movements. Loads of money is made or not made on the movement of oil prices around the world. But it was kind of like accepting inevitable that given that COVID was clearly taking huge effect, people were being sent home, no production taking place. Demand of oil around the world has fallen dramatically by about 30%. But at the same time, most of the oil which is being produced in the world has kept on pumping. Therefore, you have, in a very sort of peculiar circumstances, overproduction crisis, and therefore the price of oil was bound to fall. Okay. And what's happened since then is that although the Saudi Arabians and Putin agreed to reduce the price of oil under some sort of pressure from the United States, from Trump, they reduced it by about 10%. And of course, it's still an overproduction, because even if other countries reduce by a further 10%, which is roughly what's happened, at the moment, there's still a 10% every day overproduction of oil in the world. And that's what caused this negative price of Texas Intermediate. In other words, there's nowhere to store the stuff. And this problem will happen locally in West Texas, which is the heart of the US oil industry, but there's been a lot of concern that it could be a generalized problem. And the reason that West Texas has become once again a center of the oil industry in the US is largely because of shale oil production. Shale oil, I'll talk about a bit more as we go on, but shale oil are smaller production units at higher cost that have come onto the market in the last 10 years due to the high price of oil. This oil crisis, I was just reading the financial press today, and they're saying that the crisis is easing of this storage problem. but I'm not sure if they've really come out of the problem yet. There's loads of oil tankers arriving in the United States. This is probably a reason behind Trump's push to get the US moving again, because there's a lot of oil producing states are pressurizing him to get the economy literally moving in order to get the cars burning the oil. But also there's huge pressure now in the United States to take action against Saudi Arabia. There's even talk of an OPEC law, no to oil producing, exporting cartels. And so there's a certain sense of demonization of the Saudis for flooding the market and being a causal factor in this crisis. Okay, next one, please. So some background. I think you can see this to the right. This is one of the many scenarios that consultancies and think tanks and so on produce. This is one of the most optimistic ones, and it's in the context of the global climate change crisis, and it's looking at global CO2 emissions. Now, there's a sort of a missing bit to the top of the graph, which was really that this scenario assumes that there will be a massive expansion in the non-fossil fuel sectors of production, that is renewable, nuclear and hydro energy. On this scenario, by 2050 will have expanded massively, meaning that the fossil fuels will peak fairly soon, but then start to reduce. But even on this quite optimistic scenario, which basically sees coal reducing, gas staying more or less as it is, and oil reducing slowly, even on this scenario, then the level of reduction is far less than it needs to be in order to meet the 2-degree increase in global warming. Probably, I mean, the authors of this scenario don't actually tell us what their scenario would mean in terms of global warming, but just extending from their own figures, probably on this optimistic scenario, it would mean global warming of at least 2.5 degrees. In other words, already well into catastrophic zone. Okay, so in other words, the context of this is a question of, is oil production increasing, or will it be cut at all? Next, please. This is another scenario. This is from the International Energy Authority. The one on the right, the 3 columns on the right have been mislabeled by them. That's just a mistake. They should say sustainable development. So the 3 columns on the left are their scenario in terms of oil production if current policies hold. So the yellow bit of the bar is Middle East oil, which is the biggest producer in the world. The light blue section of those bars on the left is North American production, and you can see that if policies hold in their projection, then North American production would increase in the next 10 years and then maybe peak. Even in their highly optimistic, again, scenario of reduced fossil fuel production, you can see where most of that reduction will come from, and not very much from North America. Okay, next. Now this took actually quite a lot of effort for me to put together this, believe it or not, but I was very interested in where the world's oil is produced and where the exports are. Okay, so you can see that the OPEC countries, there's 13 of them at the moment, produce 42% of the world's oil, but their exports are 56+%. Okay, now this other group of nations who came to an agreement with OPEC, which is basically led by Russia, produce and export around about 20% of the world's oil. And then a third group, US produces 16% of the world's oil right now. However, most of it's domestically consumed. It only exports 4%. And of course, it imports about a similar amount. So it's just barely a net exporter. Canada does also export quite a lot, mostly to the US. Okay, so what you can see anyway, with OPEC plus, you add the 56% and the 21%. OPEC plus would, if they reached any agreements between them, be controlling about, what's that, 78% of the world's exports. So it is quite a strong potential for control. Next. Where does the oil come from? Where does it go to? So this, I haven't got a slick graphic to show you this, so I've tried to highlight some of the key points. If you look at the oil movements are really, they're not quite exports, they're probably a bit less than exports, but they're sort of like intercontinental, I guess, movements of oil around the world. So what you can see from this is the importance of the production of Middle East oil for Asian economies. Something like 74, 75, nearly % of all Middle East oil production goes to Asia. Okay. And then you can look at, so on the left-hand column, what we've got there is where the oil comes from, and then the row across the top is where the oil goes to. So you can see, for example, if we take the row from Russia going across horizontally, a large part of Russia's oil exports go to Europe. Not a big surprise, about 2/3, and then about 1/4 go to China. And you can see the same for other oil producing areas. So again, no big surprises really. I mean, Latin America, most of its exports go to the US, but quite a substantial amount go to China. And if you take Canada, almost all of its exports go to the US. And then you can also look at North and West Africa, and both parts of Africa supply Europe, but West Africa in particular also supplies China. So this is quite important when we come to the geopolitics of where the big movements of oil are in the world. I was trying to do next then. Next, please. Right. Now this is, I'm going to touch on the geopolitics, but not really take the point much further because it is a whole other discussion. But you can see from the map on the left, which is from the United States, and they take great interest in this, that a large proportion of the world's oil exports pass through the Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, and they also then pass on the way to China and Japan and South Korea through the Strait of Malacca just off Singapore, Malaysia. These are known as choke points in the world's oil supply. If you control these points, you control about 1/3 of the world's oil exports. So they really are choke points. And the US military strategy, by the way, to contain China is got a major part of it is naval strategy focused around these choke points. Okay, next. Now this graphic, I want you to kind of think of as your main takeaway. I know I'll give you a slightly simplified form of it, but this is a crucial point of understanding what's going on. So on the vertical axis, we've just got the price per barrel of oil, or if you like, the cost of production. So it's, you take any line, you take say $60, which has been last couple of years the normal price of oil, and you take that horizontally. I wish I had a dotted line on the graph, right? Thank you, beautiful assistant there. Take that horizontally, and what you can see is the point at which, keep going across, and you can see the point at which those greens, that's the point at which the production becomes economic for those sources of supply. That's known as the break-even point. And what you can see there is there's quite a lot of green. And that green is sources of oil supply from North America. And if you come down to the bottom end of the graph, you see quite a lot of sort of deep red, and that the